Every preacher will tell you that they'd love to preach a great sermon, even just once in a lifetime. I mean a truly great sermon, the kind of sermon that everyone who heard would remember, the kind of sermon that future generations would read, the kind of sermon that would make a profound, transforming effect upon many people. Well, I think we have to be honest that there have really only been a few people under God who've done such a thing. One of them, though, is Jesus. I think we could safely say he did it on many occasions. But probably his most famous is the Sermon on the Mount, and you can read that sermon in Matthew chapters 5 to 7. And here at St Mark's, we spent a couple of months earlier in the year going through that sermon and reminding ourselves of why it stood the test of time. We could even testify, could we not, that here again in 2021, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount had a transforming effect on us. But of course, if you've preached a sermon that memorable, where do you go next? How do you follow that? If you were reading Matthew's Gospel for the very first time, you might get to the end of chapter 7 and wonder whether there's anything left to say after that. But of course there is. It turns out that Jesus has other significant words to speak. And it turns out that Jesus is so much more than a divinely inspired preacher. And that's why the Gospel of Matthew continues into chapter 8 and chapter 9 and beyond. And so here at St Mark's this term, we're going to work our way slowly through the next 2 chapters of Matthew's Gospel. And we're going to see and hear what Jesus did after he came down from the mountaintop. We're going to experience as readers what the people of Jesus' day experienced when they came down the mountain too. Along with them, we're going to experience what happens when people meet Jesus, how he changes the lives of those he comes into contact with. And we start tonight with Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 to 13. Let me read it for us. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly, I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. What I want to do this evening is to briefly share with you 10 things that strike me about these verses. Now, you can see them on the sermon outline that you can download from our website. With each of these 10 observations, there'll be a question or two that flows out of it as well. And the first of these observations is about the crowd that follows Jesus. The next 3 are about the individuals who come to Jesus with faith. The next 4 are about Jesus himself. And then the final 2 are about the kingdom of heaven. So number 1, about the crowds. Verse 1 tells us that when Jesus came down the mountainside, large crowds followed him. And after the sermon he'd preached, it's no wonder. Crowds tend to follow famous people wherever they go. I imagine the scene here a bit like what happens when a Tiger Woods or a Phil Mickelson walk down the 18th fairway in the final round of a major golf championship. As they come down that last fairway of the day, swarms of golf fans emerge from within the trees on either side and rush in behind them as officials try to keep them from getting too close to the players. And coming down the mountainside after his famous sermon, Jesus was this kind of celebrity. And the crowds are filled with great anticipation. But what do they want from Jesus? Now, of course, none of them wanted to miss Jesus' next move, but not all of them will be Jesus' disciples. Not all of them will take Jesus seriously, because you can be part of Jesus' crowd without being one of his followers. And that observation leads me to this question. What do you want from Jesus? There are many people even today who are interested in Jesus, or perhaps even have a high regard for Jesus, but who aren't followers. Are you just curious about Jesus? Or do you want to be one of his disciples? Are you keen to be part of the crowd? Or are you keen to belong to him? Number 2. Those who come to Jesus in these verses clearly know their need. The leper in verses 2 to 4 has an obvious need. He's got a life-destroying disease, and in his day, he was also one of society's untouchables. He would likely have lived alone and away from normal civilization. As far as his Jewish neighbours were concerned, he was unclean. His life was hopeless, and he was powerless to change it, and he knew that. And I guess in his case, that's not too surprising. But what's more surprising is that even a centurion needed Jesus' help. Centurions were men of great power and authority. They were leaders of other men, military nobility. But even this centurion comes to Jesus, verse 5 we're told, asking for help. Because that's where all true faith begins, with the acknowledgement of need. Which leads me to ask, do you acknowledge your need? Can you see and say how much you need Jesus? We're all needy people in many ways. We certainly all need spiritual healing. And until we can come to Jesus admitting that need, we won't receive what he offers. Number 3, those who come to Jesus in these verses seem to not only know themselves well, but they also know Jesus. They seem to know that he's much more than a celebrity. Did you notice that the leper in verse 2 comes to Jesus and kneels before him? And did you notice that the centurion in verse 8 says that he doesn't even deserve to have Jesus come under his roof? And did you notice that both men refer to Jesus as Lord? Back in Matthew chapter 1, we read that Jesus came into the world as Emmanuel, God with us. And these two men here in chapter 8 seem to have a sense that that's exactly who Jesus is. What about you? Do you know who Jesus really is? And do you treat him as he deserves to be treated? Can you call him Lord and mean it? Is he someone you want to kneel before? Someone you want to worship? Number 4. Those who come to Jesus here seem to know not only who Jesus is, but what he can do. The centurion even says that he knows Jesus could heal his servant just with a word. But it's the words of the leper in verse 2 that most strike me here. He simply says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Whether Jesus can heal him is not in question for the leper. He knows he can. The only question is whether he's willing. And everyone who knows Jesus will share the same assumption. One ancient writer expresses it like this: "My faith can sleep sound on no other pillow than Christ's omnipotence." And so let me ask you, when you pray to Jesus for help, do you pray knowing without a doubt that Jesus can, and that the only question is whether he's willing? Do you simply assume that Jesus is capable of doing anything that you could possibly ask him? Number 5. And now we turn to the things that strike me here about Jesus himself. And the first thing here is what Jesus does in verse 3. He reaches out his hand to the leper and touches him. It's a moment of incredible compassion and beauty. Some of us are old enough to remember footage of Princess Diana back in the 80s touching AIDS patients at a time when many were afraid to do so. Even in our own historical moment, we hear about doctors and nurses getting up close as they sacrificially care for COVID patients. And here with Jesus, we see something like that, but something that's also so much more than that. Because here is someone not only full of tender compassion, but who actually doesn't fear being contaminated by uncleanness. And he doesn't fear it because he possesses in himself an even more contagious purity. Here's a man who not only touches because he cares, but because he is able to cure. How amazing is it that the only one willing to touch this leper is also the only one able to heal him? And so I ask, do you know this tenderness in Jesus? The kind of tenderness that invites us to come to him, no matter how scared or broken or unclean we may be. Do you know the Jesus who touches the untouchable? Number 6, Jesus fulfilling ancient hopes. Because in verse 4, Jesus sends the healed leper to the temple to show the priests his clean skin, as was prescribed by the Old Testament law. But this was no mere obedience. Jesus wanted him, we're told, to go as a testimony to them. A testimony to what? Well, don't you think that when the man went and told them he'd been healed, that the priests might have cause to wonder if the one who healed him was the one the Old Testament said would come? The Messiah, God's King. And so my question for us is this: do we recognise Christ as the one whom the whole Old Covenant looked forward to? Do we understand him as the one who's at the centre of God's plans? Do we read the pages of the Old Testament expecting to find him there? Number 7, his authority. Because I'm also struck by how the centurion recognises that in Jesus in verse 9. The centurion sees in Jesus a man whose authority outstripped his own. He saw that Jesus had power to combat sickness and death because somehow he had authority over them. And so I wonder, do you believe that there's no authority like his? And when you want to see something change in your own life or in the world, are you looking to a government to fix things, or to scientists to find the answer, or even to church leaders to show you the way? Or do you look to the one who has an authority like no other? Number 8, his effortless power. Because what also strikes me here, and I hope it strikes you, is how easily Jesus performs these miracles. Verse 3, Jesus touches the leper and says, "Be clean," and immediately the man's disease is gone. Immediately. And verse 13, Jesus says to the centurion, "Let it be done," and at that very moment his servant was healed. You see there, the words with which our passage ends underline the ease with which Jesus does the incredible. at that moment. And so I ask, do you see how different Jesus is to us? Do you see how different Jesus is to even the most powerful people in the world today? Do you trust that there's nothing he can't do with just a word, effortlessly? And then finally, 2 observations about God's kingdom. Number 9 is that God's kingdom is for Gentiles, like that centurion in Capernaum. This is something we probably take for granted. But there was a time when most people in the world found this idea almost impossible to believe. And in Jesus' day, certainly what he said to this Gentile centurion there in verses 10 and 11 would have shocked his hearers. Jesus said that his faith was greater than that of any Jews he'd known. Jesus said that Gentiles will be welcomed at the feast in heaven. And so I put this to you if you're a Gentile listening to this evening. Do you understand the privilege that's being spoken of here? Do you see how great it is that any person who has faith in Jesus from any nation on earth can sit next to Abraham at the heavenly banquet? But on the other side of the coin is number 10. Heaven is open to all, but hell is also real. And shockingly, Jesus says here that some of the sons of the kingdom, some of the Israelites, would find themselves there, in a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, in a place of suffering and despair. And so I ask you this very sobering question. Do you believe in hell like Jesus does? And do you fear it? Perhaps for yourself, maybe for others. Well, there are 10 things that strike me from these verses, and I really hope that you might take a couple of minutes after the sermon tonight to think about what most strikes you. And after each of the observations I've given you this evening, I've also thrown some questions at you, and I hope you'll take some time to think about them too. But at the heart of this passage is really one key question that I think is more important than all the others. I think I'd say that all the other questions come back to this one. Have you come to Jesus? And are you coming to him each and every day? That's what these 2 men did in these verses. Verse 2 says a man with leprosy came to Jesus. Verse 5 says a centurion came to him. They came with faith, recognizing their need, seeing who Jesus was and what he could do. And of course, given their needs, they undoubtedly came to the right person. They came to someone who loved them tenderly. They came to someone who, in the purposes of God, is at the very centre of human history. They came to someone who had the authority of God himself and who still does today. They came to someone who had an authority that meant there was nothing they could ask of him that he couldn't effortlessly do. And so I ask you this question tonight. Have you done what those men did? Have you come to Jesus in your need? Have you admitted that you do need him? That you in fact need him to heal you? Not just in your body, but in your soul. Have you come to see that there is a heaven and a hell? And that those who join God in heaven are only those who place their faith in Jesus, his King? Have you come to Jesus? And if you've never done that before, then these verses are full of reasons not to wait another moment. But even if you're already a believer in Jesus today, and perhaps you have been for years, I ask you the same question. with the needs and the anxieties that you have today, have you come to Jesus? With the issues and worries that tomorrow brings, to whom will you turn? If you're anything like me, you perhaps sometimes face your troubles and trials in a strangely forgetful way. Wrestling with them on your own perhaps, or turning to others who may help you but neglecting him. But whatever your needs may be, however big they may seem to you, or however small, he is more than sufficient to meet them. Whether he can is not even a question. The only question is whether he's willing. And you won't know the answer to that unless you ask. So, do you? Will you? With whatever is on your mind, with whatever burden you carry, with whatever sin you've committed, with whatever fear you're gripped by, with whatever sorrow you struggle to shake, come to him. Come to Jesus, the Jesus we meet in these verses, indescribably powerful and unspeakably tender. Come to Jesus, Jesus who is the same yesterday and today and forever.